Welcome everyone. My name is Mark Hertzberg. I'm a haematologist in Sydney at Westmead Hospital in the University of Sydney, and I happen to be chair of the Australian Leukaemia Lymphoma Group, which is our Australian cooperative clinical trials group that conduct trials in leukaemia, lymphoma and other blood disorders. So it's wonderful to have you all here. I was thinking I'm normally used to talking to patients, but not 50 or 100 at a time. So this is more daunting than the task we would normally face. Talking to doctors is easy. Talking to patients is not always so intuitive. So this is a wonderful initiative that Lymphoma Australia, together with ALLG, have provided, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank Sharon Millman for doing all the organisation for this. She's done an extraordinary job. Not only do we have many people here in Sydney, but we have hookups across Australia. We have patients dialing in from Coffs Harbour, Dubbo, Orange, Launceston, Hobart, Northern Territory, and even New Zealand. So this is really a unique opportunity for patients and relatives to learn more about lymphoma from some of the experts we have for you today, and to hopefully ask your questions in as specific a manner as we can possibly do without compromising confidentiality. So this is a unique and special day, but there's no truth in the rumour that Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd are turning up for a debate. So I can reassure you of that. However, because we have 4 experts who will be speaking to you, as Tony Abbott might say, we have the suppository of all knowledge in the room. So, as I said, we're very fortunate in having experts speak to you today. This is a patient-centred occasion. We'll be providing as much information about updates on new emerging therapies, treatment options for patients, and also some of the physical and psychological aspects that patients and their relatives confront with cancers such as lymphoma. So I think it's a nice broad cross-section that will give you new insights into a number of the aspects of treatment of lymphoma in the world today. We're especially privileged in having Professor Michael Freundschuh, who is one of the leading experts in lymphoma in the world. He conducts and is chair of one of the largest cooperative trial groups in lymphoma, and it's wonderful to have him here. He's not just an academic. He sees patients and was telling me he does ward rounds on Sunday evenings, so he isn't just a boffin who sits in a university. He's an active clinician. We're also fortunate in having 2 local specialists. We have Dr. Jason Butler from Royal Brisbane Hospital, who's an active haematologist in the area of lymphoma and transplantation. We also have Associate Professor Judith Trotman, who works here at Concord Hospital and is also an active clinical trialist within the ALLG. And fourthly, finally, we have Mayron Lees, who happens to be a patient, but is also an award-winning writer, author, and trainer who is specialising in behavioural change and resilience, and we'll be hearing from him at the end as the last speaker. So it really is a pleasure to just welcome you all here today. I hope you enjoy it, learn much, and hopefully your questions will be answered throughout the course of the afternoon. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, who is Dr. Jason Butler. He'll be talking to us today about the principles of lymphoma in Australia today, the considerations for investigation and management of patients with lymphoma as we stand today. So welcome, Jason.
Wow, what a turnout. This is absolutely extraordinary. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit differently to Mark's suggested topic, in that really I want to present on behalf of Lymphoma Australia and just explain how today's events actually happened. I wear 2 hats, as Mark suggested. I'm one of the clinical haematologists at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital and look after many patients with lymphoma there. In that role, I'm also fortunate enough to be the co-chair of the Lymphoma Multidisciplinary Team. But the hat that I'm mainly wearing today, and the reason why I'm here, is I'm also one of the board members for Lymphoma Australia. And I was very lucky that Sharon invited me to come onto the board a couple of years ago, because it certainly has opened my eyes to how much effort needs to go into improving the outcome for patients with lymphoma in this country. Now, I'll call it LA for short because it's otherwise a very long title, but LA is a not-for-profit organisation. It's a charitable organisation that's really responsible for trying to act as an advocate for patients for lymphoma in this country. I have only, as I said, recently come onto the board, but from the outset, really, the board was developed, and Lymphoma Australia was developed as an organisation by a group of people who themselves had a very personal experience with lymphoma. They were either had been patients themselves or relative of patients. So it was a very important will on their part to actually improve the outcomes for subsequent patients. So really, the board has now grown, and the Lymphoma Australia has now grown to the point where today we're able to sponsor these types of events. Now, there's really three main aims I just wanted to touch on for Lymphoma Australia, and I apologise if this does come across as a bit of a shameless plug, but I really want to just emphasise the amazing work that particularly Sharon has done to get this sort of session up and running. Now, the first important thing that I believe we have to achieve as an organisation is to really promote the awareness of lymphoma in the community. One of the things that's really not well known is that now lymphoma is probably the fifth most common malignancy that's diagnosed in this country. And a new case of lymphoma is diagnosed every 2 hours. Now, I think, unfortunately, lymphoma in the community has an identity crisis because while breast cancer and prostate cancer, very reasonably are out there in the community psyche, even lung cancer because of the anti-smoking sentiment in this day and age, I think lymphoma is not well known about. Most people out there in the real world probably haven't even heard of lymphoma, and if they have, only in very scant detail. The other important thing about lymphoma is that it is continuing to increase in incidence, so that we are making the diagnosis more often. Now, the mechanism that is leading to that happen is not actually well understood. Now, what we believe is that by promoting awareness about lymphoma, that we perhaps could make the diagnosis, if somebody is unfortunate enough to be diagnosed with lymphoma, somewhat less confronting. Having some knowledge about the disorder before you're hit with that particular term may actually help people get through the early stages post-diagnosis. There's also the possibility that if we can let the community know about the early signs and symptoms of lymphoma, that an early diagnosis could then ensue. And perhaps an early diagnosis could lead to improvement in outcomes. So Lymphoma Australia is one of the sponsors of World Lymphoma Awareness Day, happening this year on September 15, and I think most cities around the world these days now honour World Lymphoma Awareness Day by providing education sessions and such things. But also remember the motif that Lyme is for lymphoma. And you can see really throughout the Lymphoma Australia products, Lyme is the colour of choice. Now, the second important aim of Lymphoma Australia is to provide information and education, particularly to people who've already been diagnosed with lymphoma. Now, it's important to say at the outset that lymphoma is not a single entity. In fact, it's a very diverse and complex series of diseases. And that's one of the really hard things to understand, that one person's lymphoma is likely to be very different to another person's. Because of the complexity, we need to make it simpler to understand, and that's not for patients, it's more for haematologists. But at the end of the day, probably the simplest way to think about the disorder is to break it up into non-Hodgkin's and Hodgkin's lymphoma. Hodgkin's certainly being the much rarer of the two subtypes. But then within the non-Hodgkin's framework, you also can divide it up further into the B and T cell lineage diseases. What we tend to do as clinicians, though, is think more about the clinical or biological behaviour of non-Hodgkin's lymphomas. As I said, there's probably about 60 entities within the World Health Organization classification system. but we need to simplify that for our own way of thinking. And biologically, the disorders tend to range from being very slow-growing or indolent in nature, right through to the very highly aggressive or very rapidly growing types of diseases. Now, why that's important is that, to an extent, the aggression of the disease determines the type of treatments that we need to give. If you have a fairly slow-growing or indolent type of disease, generally you can start out with reasonably indolent type of treatments. For the more highly aggressive diseases, you need very aggressive, often leukemia-style protocols to get the best outcome. It also impacts upon what our expectations are. So amongst the aggressive and highly aggressive lymphomas, the majority of patients these days can be cured, and that's a very important take-home message. There can be a lot of pain and suffering getting to that point, but at the end of the day, that's the aim of the treatment. And that's quite distinct from the low-grade diseases, where in fact, whilst people will have a very prolonged survival, it's not technically curable using conventional treatments. And prognosis is a really important thing. We tell patients what our expectations are of their disease and themselves. Now again, it can't really tell you how you as an individual is going to go, but it would tell you if you put 100 individuals with the same disease in the room, how the 50% of them would fare. But we can actually use some of the baseline blood test results, baseline x-rays, and radiology investigations to come up with an overall baseline prognosis. And then we can modify that as we go through treatment. So having a good early response to treatment often predicts for prolonged survival. Whereas in fact, if you have a less than optimal response to early treatment, that can be a warning sign right from the very early stages of the disease. The other important thing about prognosis is that if we have somebody who has a particular type of lymphoma and their prognostic score looks bad, then there may be the opportunity to modify their treatment to try to have a positive impact upon that person's outcome. Now, we in Lymphoma Australia have a number of information, books and DVDs that provide information and education to patients. I'm told that I come from Generation X, and for me, having a tangible hard copy of something to look at, I find quite reassuring. But obviously now Generation Y has moved on. We're moving into the digital age. So a lot of the information you can actually get from the website, so www.lymphoma.org.au, or even through social media, so through the various Twitter and Facebook websites. We believe that these types of education sessions are probably, at the moment, the most important thing that we can provide as an organisation. Obviously, the fundraising dollar that we earn is limited, so we feel that education is putting that dollar to best use. And we hope to be able to replicate this type of audience, this type of forum across Australia, and do it often. The third aim, and this is probably where the shameless plug comes in, is really we are a charitable organisation, so fundraising is a critical part of what we do. And that's, I think, where Sharon's been an incredible gift to Lymphoma Australia, and that her ability to get out there and raise funds in an extraordinary way. Again, Lyme is for lymphoma, so that was the motif I mentioned before. Probably one of the most amazing things was getting the Opera House lit up with the lime colour, but also other events like Opera to Parliament, bike riding event as well. Now, one of the things to remember is that lymphoma doesn't just affect the average Joe on the street, it can affect anybody. And probably most people in this audience are aware of famous actors, musicians, sportsmen, and even politicians who've had lymphoma come into their lives unexpectedly. So those people also provide an opportunity for us to get the word about lymphoma out there into the community. Now, there's a couple of ways that anybody in the audience here can help. First of all, you can actively participate in one of the fundraising events, but probably the easier way for most people, and particularly if you have friends or colleagues who ask, well, what can I do? Get them to go to the website and click on the Donate Money tab, and you can, just even a small amount can help keep events like this running. All right, well, that's really all I wanted to say from the perspective of Lymphoma Australia, and sort of like now to move on to the main part of the education session.